The night they threw my clothes into the rain, I finally understood. I wasn't family. I was the furniture they were tired of keeping. The thunder rolled like a warning from heaven, shaking the small compound as if the sky itself wanted to witness my humiliation. My aunt's voice tore through the storm, sharp and shrill, slicing through the air heavier than the rain. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my hands still dripping with soap and shame, watching her face twist in fury over a single broken glass. But I knew this anger wasn't about the cup. It was about me. I had become the mistake she could no longer hide behind kindness. My uncle appeared behind her, his arms crossed, his face carved with silent judgment. "You should be grateful, girl," he said coldly. "We took you in when no one else wanted you." That sentence burned worse than the slap that followed. I had heard it all my life, the reminder that my presence was charity, that my existence was a favor they could take back at any time. After my parents died, I came to this house believing I'd found a family, but instead, I found a prison disguised as a home. Every day began before dawn. I swept, scrubbed, cooked, washed, and polished. By sunrise, the house sparkled. Everything except my soul. My cousins left for school in clean uniforms while I scrubbed the stains from their shoes. The same hands that packed their food never touched my own plate. I learned to survive on leftovers and silence, to swallow tears before they could fall. My mat by the kitchen door became my world, thin, cold, and constant. At night, I listened to the soft breathing of a house that would never love me back. I still remember the first time my aunt stopped calling me by my name. She began saying "house girl" instead, a word that carried chains. Slowly, my name faded from their tongues, from my chores, from existence. I became what I did, not who I was, and I let it happen because I thought obedience might buy belonging. But belonging never came. That night, when the glass broke, I think something else broke too. The fragile illusion that I mattered. My aunt's fury was relentless, her words stabbing through every inch of my restraint. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, grabbing the small bag that held all my things. 2 dresses, a comb, and an old photograph of my mother, and flinging it into the rain. My uncle didn't stop her. My cousins stood behind the doorway, watching quietly, their eyes full of something that looked like pity, but smelled like relief. I stepped into the storm without a word, my tears lost in the downpour. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, heavy and cold, pulling at my skin like punishment. I knelt by the mango tree, clutching my bag, staring at the house where I had once begged for acceptance. Through the window's faint glow, I could see them moving about, warm and dry, as if nothing had happened. I thought about knocking, about apologizing one last time. But something deep inside me whispered that this was how my story was meant to begin, not end. I waited until the storm softened into a whisper. My body was trembling, but my mind was strangely calm, the kind of stillness that comes after breaking completely. Then I heard their voices again. My aunt's laughter drifted through the thin walls, low and cruel. "She'll never survive out there," she said. "That one was born to serve. She'll always crawl back to us." My uncle's reply came like gravel dragged across stone. "Let her go. She'll learn that she belongs nowhere but here." Their words didn't just sting, they branded me. For years I had believed I was powerless, but that night something inside me shifted. The storm outside raged, but the one inside me was fiercer. I looked at their house one last time, the glow from the window fading behind the rain, and I swore to the sky. If they believed I'd always crawl back, they didn't know the woman I was about to become. The cold floor didn't just carry my body. It carried my tears, my hunger, and every dream they told me I wasn't allowed to have. I used to think the floor was punishing me for being poor, but over time, I realized it was teaching me how to rise quietly. Every morning began before the world woke. The air was still dark, heavy with dew, and the silence of dawn pressed down like another weight I had to carry. My eyes would open to the familiar chill of the cement beneath my mat, a cold so deep it felt like it had seeped into my bones. I'd listen for the soft snores from the rooms beyond the kitchen, my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, the people who called me family only when others were watching. Once their world slipped back into sleep, mine began. The first sound was always water, buckets clanging against metal basins, firewood crackling beneath the pot, the hiss of steam rising into the half-dark room. My hands were rough from scrubbing, my back bent before the sun even touched the roof. By the time the sky turned pale, the house would smell of porridge and polish, everything in its place except me. My cousins woke to warm water, clean clothes, and breakfast I had cooked. I woke to orders and the reminder that I was lucky to even have a roof over my head. But the floor, that cold, unkind floor, became something more than punishment. It was my witness. Every night, when exhaustion pulled me down, I'd press my cheek to it and let the tears fall silently. I never cried loudly. Crying loud was for people who expected comfort. My tears had no audience, so I learned to make them soundless. The floor knew every secret I couldn't speak, the ache in my chest when my aunt's voice sliced through me, the hunger that twisted my stomach when they locked the pantry, the quiet dreams I whispered to the cracks in the wall. My biggest dream wasn't riches or revenge. It was a classroom. The kind I'd seen before my aunt pulled me out of school. I still remembered the smell of chalk and books, the thrill of reading words that built entire worlds in my head. When I washed my cousins' uniforms, I'd run my fingers along the fabric and imagine myself wearing one again. Sometimes I'd sneak into the backyard with torn newspapers, tracing the letters under the moonlight until my eyes burned. I'd whisper them to the air, each letter a promise I refused to forget. The only person who ever looked at me and saw more than a maid was Madame Grace, my old teacher. She'd find me at the market sometimes, her face lighting up with surprise and sadness. "You should be in school, not here," she'd say softly, pressing a few coins into my hand. "Don't stop learning, child. You were born for more than this floor." Her words stayed with me longer than any meal I ever ate. They became my heartbeat when silence got too heavy. Days passed like pages in a book I wasn't allowed to read. My aunt's voice was my alarm, her anger, my schedule, her silence, my punishment. Every act of kindness I offered only seemed to remind her that I was beneath her, that I owed her gratitude for every breath I took. But I stayed quiet, because silence was armor. You cannot hit what does not speak. Then one afternoon, fate slipped through the cracks. My cousin came home from school, tossed her bag onto the chair, and ran off to gossip with her friends. Papers spilled across the floor. I bent to gather them, as I always did. That's when I saw it. A letter sealed with the government emblem, the kind I hadn't seen since my school days. My heart raced as I turned it over. My name was printed on it, my real name, not housegirl, not you. I read it once, then twice, my eyes stinging. It was a scholarship letter, a full award to return to school. Books, uniforms, everything paid for. My hands trembled as I realized what it meant. Someone had seen me. Someone had believed I was still worth saving. I wanted to scream with joy, to thank Madame Grace, to run out and tell the sky. But I didn't. Because in this house, good news was dangerous. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it against my chest, feeling its heartbeat match mine. I slipped it into my blouse, the edges scratching my skin like a secret too sharp to hold. When night came, I waited until the house was asleep, then crept to my mat. I lifted the thin mattress and slid the letter beneath it, my fingers trembling as though hiding a living thing. That night, I didn't cry into the floor. I whispered to it, "Keep my secret safe." The cold beneath me no longer felt cruel. It felt like protection. But as I began to drift to sleep, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, careful, listening. A shadow paused by the curtain, the air too still to be empty. And I realized, sometimes the walls don't need to speak to tell you your secret isn't yours anymore. When dreams burn, they don't make smoke. They make silence. And that silence stayed inside me long after the flames died. The morning it happened, the house smelled of soap and kerosene. I remember that smell because it clung to my skin for weeks after, even when I tried to wash it away. I woke before dawn, as always, but something in the air felt different. Heavy, expectant, like the sky knew what was coming. My body moved through the motions automatically, fetching water, scrubbing the veranda, lighting the firewood. But beneath it all, my mind hummed with quiet hope. The scholarship letter was still hidden under my mattress, its promise whispering to me through every breath. Soon, it seemed to say. Soon, you'll be free. When I finished my chores, I slipped away to the backyard, pulling the letter from its hiding place. I unfolded it slowly, my heart swelling as I traced my name. Proof that somewhere in this world, someone believed I was worth something. I was so lost in that moment that I didn't hear her footsteps behind me until it was too late. My aunt's voice cut through the air like a knife. "What is that?" she demanded. My body froze, the paper still trembling in my hand. She snatched it before I could move, her eyes narrowing as she read. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Her face changed. Disbelief first, then rage. "You think you can deceive me? You think you can leave this house without my permission?" Her voice rose, sharp and shaking. "After everything I've done for you." I tried to explain. I tried to tell her that it wasn't deceit, that it was an opportunity, a miracle even. But the words tangled in my throat, trapped between fear and desperation. My uncle came out, his expression already hardened before he even knew what was wrong. She thrust the letter into his hands, her voice trembling with fury. "She's been hiding this, lying under our roof, plotting to abandon us after all we've given her." He didn't read it carefully. He didn't need to. His loyalty had never been to fairness, only to control. "So this is how you repay kindness," he said, his tone dripping with disgust. "A thief of opportunity." He grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight. "This is what happens when you give a stray a home." I begged then, words spilling like tears. "Please, Uncle, I didn't steal anything. It's just school. I only wanted to learn." My aunt's laughter was sharp and cruel. "Learn? You think you're better than my children? You think reading books will change who you are?" She tore the letter in half. The sound was small, but it felt like the sky itself had cracked. Before I could react, she walked to the kitchen hearth. The flames were already glowing low, red and patient. She dropped the pieces of paper into it. I watched them curl, blacken, and vanish, the words turning to ash before my eyes. The scholarship, my hope, my name, all swallowed by fire. I fell to my knees, the world spinning around me. "Why?" I whispered. But no one answered. My aunt's face was hard as stone. "You'll stay here and work. Dreams don't feed anyone." My uncle nodded in agreement. "If she wants to chase fire, let her burn." The smell of smoke filled the kitchen, but it wasn't the kind that clung to clothes. It was the kind that lodged in your soul, the smell of something sacred dying. I stayed on the floor long after they left, my hand stretched toward the ashes as if I could piece them back together. But fire doesn't give back what it takes. It devours and forgets. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't speak. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, the weight of silence pressing against my chest. I thought of Madame Grace, of her voice telling me not to stop learning. I thought of the letter's edges, how warm they'd felt against my skin when I'd hidden it. I thought of how easily everything I loved could turn to dust in someone else's hands. And then, somewhere between anger and grief, something broke inside me. Not like a crack, but like a release. I realized that if I stayed, they would burn everything I ever reached for. They would reduce me to obedience until even my heartbeat belonged to them. I couldn't let that happen. So I waited. I waited until the moon climbed high and the house fell still. The wind whispered through the broken shutters, and the ashes in the hearth glowed faintly, like dying stars. I rose quietly, my heart pounding so loud I feared it would wake the walls. I gathered my few belongings, the old photograph of my mother, the clothes they hadn't yet torn, and the memory of that letter, and held them close. I opened the door with shaking hands, the night air rushing in like freedom wearing a storm's disguise. The earth was wet beneath my feet, but I didn't care. Every step away from that house felt like breathing for the first time. The wind howled behind me, carrying the smell of smoke and salt tears. My bare feet cut against the gravel road, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back, not even when the dogs barked or my aunt's voice echoed faintly through the night. The house that took everything from me was shrinking behind the trees, its fire dying in the distance. And I swore, whatever it took, I would build a life so bright it would blind anyone who had tried to keep me in the dark. When you have nowhere to sleep, even the earth feels like it's pushing you away. You start to realize that the world doesn't hate you. It just doesn't notice you exist. The night I ran away, I thought freedom would taste sweet, but by the second sunrise, it tasted like dust and hunger. The road stretched endlessly before me, a strip of cracked earth that hummed with heat by day and froze by night. My feet were blistered, my stomach hollow, and my heart louder than my footsteps. Each mile took me farther from the house that had burned my dreams, but it also took me deeper into a world that didn't care if I disappeared. The first night, I slept behind a row of wooden stalls in the marketplace, where the smell of spoiled fruit mixed with rain and smoke. The ground was damp, uneven, and cold, but exhaustion doesn't care about comfort. I curled up beneath a piece of torn tarpaulin and closed my eyes, listening to the hum of insects and the distant laughter of people who had beds to return to. The floor of my aunt's house had been hard, but at least it was a floor that belonged to someone. Out here, even the soil felt borrowed. By morning, my hunger had become a physical ache. The vendors began setting up, their voices cutting through the dawn. I watched as they arranged piles of oranges and cassava, the colors bright against the gray dust. When the smell became unbearable, I offered to sweep their stalls in exchange for food. Most waved me away, muttering that I looked like trouble. One man, an old fruit seller with tired eyes and cracked hands, finally nodded. "Sweep fast," he said. "No one likes pity that lingers." I worked until my palms bled from gripping the broom, but when I finished, he handed me a bruised mango. I remember holding it like treasure, my throat tight with gratitude. "You have people?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. He sighed. "Then you'll learn this city eats those who don't have names. Be careful who feeds you." That became my first lesson in survival. I learned where to sleep when the market closed, under the wooden tables, where the rain didn't reach. I learned which shop owners might let me wash their floors for coins, and which ones would chase me with insults instead. I learned that hunger makes you invisible, and that invisibility can be a kind of safety. The days blurred together. Endless cycles of work, hunger, and restless sleep. I scrubbed pavements, carried crates, washed dishes in back alleys, anything that kept me moving. My clothes stiffened with dirt, my hands cracked from the constant scrubbing, but I told myself it was temporary. I was free, even if freedom came dressed in pain. Sometimes I'd see children walking to school, their laughter piercing through the noise of the city, like a sound I used to know. I would pause just for a moment, watching them from behind the fruit stalls. Their uniforms gleamed under the morning sun, their books tucked neatly under their arms. And in those moments, the ache in my chest grew heavier than my hunger. That could have been me. That should have been me. One evening, The rain began before the clouds even warned us. The market scattered in panic, traders shouting, canopies flapping, fruit rolling across the mud. I stayed, drenched and shivering, because I had nowhere to run. The air was thick and cold, my fingers numb as I watched the world blur into gray. Then I noticed the cars, sleek and shining even in that exhausting rain, pulling up at the far end of the street. Their windows tinted, their engines humming like beasts too proud to care about the storm. A man stepped out, tossing a bottle into the gutter without looking. I ran forward, wiping mud from my face, and began washing the car beside his, desperate for the few coins the drivers sometimes threw to street kids. My hands worked fast, the soap mixing with the rainwater, my heart racing with cold and fear. The rain made my dress cling to my body, heavy and dripping, but I kept scrubbing, refusing to stop. That's when I saw her. She stood beneath a large black umbrella, her heels sinking slightly into the wet earth. The kind of woman who didn't belong in a market. Her clothes immaculate, her posture quiet but commanding. Her gaze lingered on me longer than anyone else's had in months. I tried not to meet her eyes, but something in them felt different. Not pity, not disgust, curiosity. When I finished, I stepped back, expecting silence or dismissal. Instead, she spoke, her voice low and certain. "You work like someone who's fighting ghosts." I froze, unsure how to respond. The drivers around us laughed, one muttering something about street rats, but she ignored them. She looked straight at me, her eyes sharp but kind. "What's your name?" she asked. For a moment, I almost said, "House girl." It was the only name I'd answered for years. Then I swallowed hard and whispered my real one. Her expression softened, and she tilted her head slightly. "Do you want to keep washing cars in the rain?" she asked. "Or would you like a real job?" Her question struck like lightning. Sudden, blinding, impossible. I stared at her, unsure if she was real, if this was another dream waiting to burn. The rain slowed, turning to mist that clung to my skin. Her car door opened behind her, the warmth spilling out like an invitation I'd never dared to hope for. My feet trembled, caught between fear and the faintest flicker of faith. She reached out a hand, steady, waiting, and for the first time since I'd run away, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, the road was finally leading somewhere. The day I met her, I stopped looking down. For years, the earth had been my home. The floor, the dust, the mud beneath my bare feet. But she was the first person who made me lift my head and see the sky again. When I stepped into her car that rainy afternoon, I didn't know I was walking into the beginning of my rebirth. The scent of leather and perfume filled the air, soft, warm, unfamiliar. I sat at the edge of the seat, afraid to leave stains, afraid to breathe too loudly. The woman who had stopped me in the rain sat beside me, calm and composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap. There was something about her presence, not loud, not demanding, but firm, like someone who had long ago learned the power of silence. Her name was Madame Adana. She didn't ask for my story. She didn't need to. She only asked my name again, slowly this time, as if memorizing it. Then she said, "You'll work for me. You'll clean. You'll help in the kitchen. You'll learn. But under my roof, no one sleeps on the floor." Those words broke something inside me, not in pain, but in disbelief. For years, I had been told my place was beneath others, that I was lucky to exist in the spaces between their comfort. Yet here she was, speaking as though I belonged in a place with light and walls that didn't hum with cruelty. When we reached her house, I hesitated before stepping inside. The walls were painted in soft tones, the floor smooth and shining. The smell of bread and lavender drifted through the air. For a second, I thought I'd walked into another world. The other workers watched me curiously. They moved with quiet confidence, none of the bitterness I was used to. They greeted her with respect, not fear. And when she spoke, They listened not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was the first time I'd seen power used without cruelty. That night I slept on a real bed, with sheets that smelled of sunlight and soap. I wept silently into the pillow, not from sadness, but because my body didn't know what comfort felt like anymore. Madame Adana was a woman of habits, precise, graceful, and disciplined. She rose before dawn, prayed, then walked through the house with quiet steps that somehow carried authority. I learned quickly how to set a table without a sound, how to fold linen to sharp perfection, how to move through a home with purpose. But beyond the chores, she taught me something no one else ever had: self-respect. "You don't serve because you are less," she told me one morning, her voice steady. "You serve because you know the value of effort. That is strength, not shame." Those words changed me. Slowly, the shame I had worn like a second skin began to fade. I found myself standing taller, speaking clearer. She gave me tasks that challenged me, keeping inventory, assisting in planning her events, even reading out her correspondence. When I stumbled over difficult words, she corrected me with patience. "Knowledge," she'd say with a soft smile, "isn't owned by the rich. It's borrowed by the willing." Under her roof, I rediscovered my voice. She treated me not as a servant, but as a student. She noticed my effort, praised my diligence, and demanded excellence, not perfection. I started saving the small wages she paid me, writing down every coin in a notebook she'd gifted me. At night, I'd sit by my window, watching the city lights blink like distant promises, and whisper to myself that maybe life was giving me another chance. Sometimes she'd invite me to sit with her on the veranda after dinner, where she'd sip tea and speak softly about her past, a life of struggle, betrayal, and rebuilding. "People see wealth," she said once, her eyes distant, "but they never see the wounds that built it." I listened to her voice and realized we were more alike than I thought. Two women shaped by pain, but refusing to let it define them. Months turned into years. I became the person she trusted most. She'd hand me her keys when she traveled, leaving me in charge when she was away. I felt pride bloom inside me, quiet but powerful. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was growing. My world had color now. The blue of dawn through the curtains, the green of the garden she planted with her own hands, the gold of the sun as it poured through the windows every morning. Then one evening, everything shifted. We sat together in the sitting room, the scent of rain heavy in the air. She was quiet, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Finally, she said, "Ebele, I need to tell you something." My chest tightened at the sound of my name, the name I hadn't heard spoken with such gentleness in years. She looked at me then, her eyes holding something that felt both tender and heavy. "I'm leaving for abroad," she said softly. "There are things I must take care of. But—" She paused, the silence thick between us. "I'm not leaving you with nothing." Her words hung in the air, sweet and terrifying all at once. I tried to ask what she meant, but the look in her eyes silenced me, a mixture of sorrow and pride. Outside, thunder rumbled softly, like the earth exhaling. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a folded envelope with my name written in her graceful hand. And before I could breathe, she whispered, "It's time you learned what your wings feel like." Sometimes, the smallest key opens the biggest destiny. I didn't understand her words until I turned that key and realized she had left me not a gift, but a doorway. The morning Madame Adana left, the world felt still, as if it too was holding its breath. Her car waited at the gate, her bags neatly packed, her white scarf fluttering softly in the wind. I stood on the veranda, trying not to cry. She turned to me one last time, her eyes kind, but full of something deeper, the weight of parting. "You'll do great things, Ebele," she said, slipping a small brass key into my palm. "You'll know what it opens when the time is right." Before I could ask, She smiled that soft, knowing smile of hers and walked away. When the car disappeared down the road, the silence inside the house felt heavy. I held the key tightly, feeling its coldness press into my skin, its mystery burning into my thoughts. That night, when I finally unfolded the envelope she had left on my table, my breath caught in my throat. Her handwriting, steady and elegant, carried words that changed my life forever. There's a small provision shop in Ojuelegba. It's yours now. Make it yours in every way that matters. The next morning, I set out with the key and trembling hands. The streets of Ojuelegba were lively, noisy, crowded, ruthless. When I reached the shop, I almost laughed through my tears. It was tiny, squeezed between a tailor's shack and a bakery. The wooden sign faded and the roof patched with rusted sheets. Yet as I turned the key in the lock, I felt something sacred move within me. The door creaked open, dust swirling in the dim light, and for a moment I saw possibility hiding beneath the neglect. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first days were hard. Customers barely came. I arranged the few goods on the shelves, swept the floor twice a day just to keep busy, and prayed over every coin I earned. Some nights, I cried quietly behind the counter, wondering if I was foolish to think I could build something from nothing. But I remembered her words. Knowledge isn't owned by the rich, it's borrowed by the willing. So I borrowed. I watched other traders, studied how they spoke, how they smiled, how they made people feel seen. Slowly, I learned to do the same. Soon, small miracles began to unfold. One woman came for a tin of milk, then returned the next day for sugar. A driver stopped for water, then brought his friends. My hands learned to count change without trembling. My smile began to feel real. I painted the walls cream and hung a new sign, Ebele's Corner. It wasn't grand, but when I saw my name on that board, my heart swelled. For the first time, I didn't feel like a servant. I felt like a woman building her future brick by brick. Months turned into a year, and the shop grew. I learned which goods sold best, how to save for the slow days, how to negotiate with suppliers who underestimated me. When it rained and water flooded the entrance, I stood barefoot in the mud, serving customers with laughter in my voice. Each day brought struggle, but behind every hardship was a quiet victory. Every profit, no matter how small, was proof that I was no longer the girl who slept on the floor. I was the woman who had learned to stand on her own. Then one evening, everything shifted again. The rain was falling lightly, tapping against the tin roof like a lullaby. I was counting the day's earnings when a man walked in. He wore a charcoal suit, his shoes too polished for this part of town. He looked around slowly, his eyes studying every corner before they settled on me. "You run this place?" he asked. I nodded, unsure of his tone. He smiled faintly. "You've done well," he said, placing a white card on the counter. "People like you don't stay small for long." I picked up the card, my fingers trembling. The gold letters shimmered under the weak light. Okoro Investments Limited. Beneath it, an invitation. "Meet us tomorrow. We'd like to discuss a property opportunity." For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the card as rain drummed softly outside. The shop, my shop, suddenly felt too small for the dreams now stirring in me. I closed my hand around the card, its edges biting into my skin like a promise. Maybe this was another test, or the next door her key had meant to open. And as thunder rolled faintly beyond the city, I whispered to myself, "It's my turn now." I once washed floors, now I signed papers that built them. But the hands that once scrubbed dirt still trembled when they held a pen. The next morning, after that stranger left my shop, I couldn't stop thinking about the white card burning in my pocket. Okoro Investments Limited. It sounded like a world far above mine. A world of suits, meetings, and polished words. I was the girl who had once sold sachet water on the street. What did I know about property or business? Yet something deep within whispered that maybe this was what Madame Adana had seen in me all along. She hadn't just left me a key. She had left me courage. When I reached the company's office, the glass doors reflected a version of me I barely recognized. Simple dress, worn shoes, and eyes filled with hope. The receptionist looked up politely, and I introduced myself, clutching the invitation as though it were a shield. Within minutes, I was ushered into a boardroom where 3 men sat around a long table. They listened as I spoke, nervously, truthfully, about how I had turned a small provisions shop into a steady business through nothing but hard work and faith. They exchanged glances, then one smiled. "We need that kind of honesty," he said. "How would you like to manage small housing supplies for our next project?" That's how it began. My first step into real estate. It wasn't glamorous. I started by delivering cement to construction sites, keeping track of orders, learning the difference between sand grades and cement strength. Every day brought a new challenge: stolen materials, unpaid invoices, men who laughed at the idea of a woman managing supplies. But I refused to bow. I worked harder, learned faster, and treated every worker with respect. Slowly, the laughter faded. They began calling me Madam Brick, a name that made me smile every time I heard it. Months turned into years. My small supply business grew into something bigger, a registered firm with my name on the letterhead, Ebele Constructions Limited. I hired workers from the same streets I had once slept on, giving them the jobs no one else offered. We built slowly, one house at a time, learning through mistakes and storms. Some days I stood at half-built sites under the sun, sweat pouring down my back, signing papers with hands that still carried scars from scrubbing floors. Each signature felt like rewriting my past, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, hope by hope. People began to notice. Clients trusted my honesty. Banks opened doors that had once been locked to people like me. My name, Ebele, started to mean something beyond pity. It became a symbol of grit, of a girl who refused to let poverty be her surname. Interviews followed, newspaper stories, community, programs. Young girls came to my office asking how I had done it, and I always told them the same thing. You don't build walls, you build faith, and faith holds stronger than any cement. Still, success carried its own shadows. Nights grew longer, loneliness deeper. There were moments when I'd look at the city skyline, the one I had helped raise, and feel tears burn in my eyes. I had become everything I once prayed for, yet sometimes I still felt like that orphan girl begging for a place to belong. Every win reminded me of the people who once said I would never leave the floor. And maybe that's why I worked so hard, not just to prove them wrong, but to prove that pain could build, not just break. Then one morning, as I sat in my office reviewing contracts, my secretary rushed in with wide eyes and trembling hands. "Madam," she said breathlessly, "we've been awarded the new development project, the biggest one yet." She handed me the letter. My heart thudded as I read the details. The government had selected Ebele Constructions Limited to oversee a large housing project. My eyes froze at the last line. The project location. My breath caught. It was the same town I had once fled barefoot in the rain, the place that had burned my hope to ashes. Now I was returning. Not as a beggar, but as a builder. The past I had run from was waiting, not with cruelty, but with unfinished lessons. I stared at the map, my name beside it in bold letters, and I whispered to myself, half in fear, half in triumph, the floor I once slept on just became the foundation I'll build upon. The air smelled the same, only I was different. The same dust, the same rain, the same wind that once carried my tears now carried whispers of my name. The road into my hometown was narrower than I remembered, lined with the same crooked trees that once towered over my childhood. Every bump, every turn, every shadow brought memories rushing back. Nights spent on cold floors, mornings filled with orders and silence. But this time, I wasn't walking barefoot with a broken spirit. I was returning in a car with my company's logo painted on the side, my name written in gold on papers that carried power. Still, the deeper I drove into that street, the smaller I felt, as if the years I had conquered folded back into a single ache in my chest. The town hadn't changed much. Children still chased each other through the muddy lanes, women still carried water on their heads, and the air still held the faint scent of firewood and palm oil. Only I had changed. My clothes cleaner, my face sharper, my silence now heavy with things unspoken. When my car stopped near the corner of the street where I had once lived, I saw it. The old house. The cracked walls still leaned to one side, the roof patched with tin, the same window where I had once watched the rain while my stomach growled in the dark. For a moment, my breath caught. It felt as though time had waited for me, untouched, unmoved, daring me to face what I had become. People began to gather quietly. Faces I half recognized turned toward me. The woman who used to fetch water beside me, the man who once chased me away from his store, the children of those who once watched me scrub floors. Their whispers rippled through the air. Is that not Eboli? The girl who used to sleep by the kitchen. Look at her now. God is truly strange. Some smiled. Others stared, their curiosity a mix of pride and disbelief. I greeted them all, bowing slightly, humility softening the strength I had fought so hard to build. Then, across the road, I saw them, my aunt and uncle. Age had not been kind to them. My aunt's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock that quickly turned to shame. My uncle stood frozen, his once proud posture now bent by time and regret. I could see it in their faces, the memory of every cruel word, every command that reduced me to a shadow in their home. But I didn't speak of it. I only smiled gently, as if to say, I forgave you long before you realized I could. Later that day, I met with the town's chief surveyor. He brought out a map, pointing to plots of land available for purchase. My finger stopped at one, the one directly beside my relative's compound. This one, I said calmly. He looked surprised. Madam, that's quite close to your family? I smiled faintly. Yes, some roots aren't meant to be cut, just replanted. The negotiations were quick. The paperwork is long. Every signature I placed carried the weight of my past. A girl who had once begged for a blanket, now signing deeds for acres. When the final document slid across the table, I hesitated for a heartbeat, remembering that floor where I had once slept, the cold that bit through my skin, the nights I prayed for escape. My hand didn't tremble when I took the pen this time. I signed with a steady grace, not out of pride, but peace. The town buzzed with news before sunset. Ebeli bought land, they whispered. She's building something big. Children followed my car as it left the site, their laughter ringing like music. My aunt watched from her doorway, eyes glistening with something that looked like both sorrow and wonder. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't here to boast, that I wasn't here to remind her of what she'd done. I was here to show her what mercy looks like when it grows from pain. That evening, I stood on the new plot as the sun melted into gold across the horizon. The soil felt warm beneath my heels, the air heavy with memory. A soft breeze carried the sound of church bells and children's laughter. I closed my eyes and whispered, I'm home. Not the home they had denied me, but the one I had built for myself in spirit, long before I laid a single brick. The next morning, I met the architect by the plot's edge. He handed me the final blueprints. Bold, beautiful, towering. I signed the deed, the pen gliding over paper like a promise. And when I looked up, the sunlight fell across the old house where I once slept on the floor. I smiled softly and said, let the mansion face it. I wanted to see what love can rebuild. Every wall I raised whispered, you survived. I didn't build that mansion to show wealth. I built it so the silence that once broke me could finally echo with pride. The first day the foundation was dug, I stood barefoot on the soil, feeling its warmth rise through my feet. The same ground that had once been my bed was now the base of something far greater. A dream I had shaped from hunger, heartbreak, and prayer. The workers looked at me with quiet respect, unsure how to address a woman who gave orders with humility and paid them with fairness. "Call me Abele," I said, smiling softly, the same way everyone used to. But the truth was, I wasn't the same anymore. Every instruction I gave, every brick I laid, was a conversation with my past. The girl who had been told she'd never rise, now teaching the ground how to hold her name. The mansion's design wasn't born from vanity. It was built from memory. I told the architect, "I don't want luxury. I want meaning." So he listened, and together we shaped a home that spoke without words. The entrance stood wide and welcoming, for every door that had once been closed to me. The kitchen stretched open, filled with light, a place where I could feed anyone who entered, unlike the nights I had gone to sleep hungry. I designed a small library, too, even though I'd never finished school. It would hold the books I never got to read, a promise to the child I once was. The workers came from the same streets I had once called home, single mothers, jobless young men, widowers who had lost everything. I paid them fair wages, served them food during breaks, and treated them with dignity. Some called me Madam, others called me Sister Ebele. But when one man, gray-haired and gentle, whispered, "You remind me of my daughter," I smiled through the sting of tears, because I knew what he meant. I had become what I once needed, someone's hope that hard days don't last forever. Each day, I watched the walls rise higher, brick by brick, color by color. The scent of wet cement filled the air, and the rhythm of hammers echoed like music. Sometimes I worked alongside them, carrying water, mixing sand, refusing to sit idle while others built my dream. They laughed at first, but when they saw I meant it, their laughter turned into admiration. "Our madam is one of us," they'd say, and I would nod quietly, because they were right. No matter how high the walls grew, I never forgot the floor I had come from. Weeks turned into months, and the mansion began to take shape. White walls gleaming against the sun, wide verandas catching the breeze. Children passing by would stop and stare, their eyes wide with wonder. Some would whisper, "She used to live there," pointing toward the small old house beside the site. Their mothers would hush them, but I'd smile and wave. I didn't want the past erased. I wanted it remembered, because every pain I had endured had become part of this structure. The house wasn't just mine. It belonged to every girl who had been told she was nothing. When the marble floors were polished and the final coat of paint dried, I walked through the rooms in silence. My footsteps echoed softly, and with each one a memory answered back. The slap of a bucket on concrete, the whisper of my aunt's voice telling me I'd never be more than a servant, the sound of rain hitting the floor where I used to sleep. Now that floor had become marble, shining like a mirror that reflected strength, not sorrow. On the front lawn, I planted a single rose bush, the same red roses Madame Adana used to keep by her window. "For her," I whispered, "for the woman who handed me the key to this destiny." The petals shimmered under the sun, bright and defiant, like fire that refused to burn out. The workers gathered that afternoon for a small celebration, music playing, laughter spilling into the air. They danced barefoot on the grass, their joy raw and real. I stood by the gate, watching the sunset stain the walls gold, thinking of how far I had come. For the first time in years, peace didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like home. Then, just as the drums quieted, I heard a familiar voice call my name, sharp, trembling, unbelieving. I turned slowly. My aunt stood at the edge of the site, her face pale with shock, her hands clutching her wrapper as if it could hold her steady. Her eyes darted from the towering mansion to me, the girl she once called worthless. For a long, heavy moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Ebele, this house is yours?" And I looked at her, calm and steady, and said, "It always was. You just couldn't see it." They came to see a mansion. They met their mirror. And in that reflection, every cruelty they had ever given me came quietly back, not as revenge, but as revelation. The morning they arrived, the mansion smelled of fresh lilies and new beginnings. My staff had prepared the dining room with quiet precision, silverware gleaming, chairs polished, the scent of roasted chicken floating through the air. I hadn't invited them, but I wasn't surprised when the knock came. Pride always finds its way back to the place it once looked down on. I stood at the window for a moment before opening the door, steadying my breath, my heart a calm sea after years of storms. There they were, my aunt, her face older, her scarf faded from years of wear, my uncle thinner, slower, holding onto his walking stick like it was the last thing keeping him upright. Behind them stood two of their children, now grown, but carrying the same arrogance I once knew. Though beneath it, I could see discomfort, a quiet awareness that they no longer stood above me. For a second, none of us spoke. Then my aunt smiled, brittle and uncertain. "Ebele," she said softly, "it's been too long." "It has," I replied, stepping aside. "Please come in." Their eyes widened as they entered, taking in the shining marble floors, the chandelier that scattered sunlight into rainbows, the photographs on the walls of my company's projects, of communities built from the same soil where I had once been denied a home. They moved through the rooms in silence, the click of their shoes echoing like ghosts. My uncle cleared his throat. "You've done well," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the staircase that spiraled upward. "Very well." "I worked hard," I said simply. "Life has a way of rewarding what it once ignored." We sat in the living room, a space that smelled of calm and history. My aunt's eyes roamed over the furniture, her fingers tracing the embroidery of the cushions. I could feel the weight of her memory pressing against the silence. Every night I'd spent on the floor of her kitchen, every time she'd called me by another name instead of my own. Now she was sitting where I had once been forbidden to. I poured her tea with steady hands, not out of obligation, but choice. And that choice was power. She tried to speak, her voice catching halfway through. We heard, "You built this yourself?" "With help," I said gently. "From the same kind of people I used to be." I didn't mean it as a wound, but I saw her flinch slightly, the truth hitting softer than blame, but harder than forgiveness. Lunch passed with polite conversation. My cousins complimented the art, the decor, even the view, their smiles thin, their laughter too light. They asked about my travels, my work, the businesses I owned. I answered each question calmly, never boasting, never lowering my voice. Because dignity doesn't shout, it stands. When we finally sat for dinner, the air grew heavier. The table was long, lined with candles that flickered like restless memories. My staff served quietly, moving with grace, and my relatives watched them with uneasy admiration. My aunt finally looked at me across the table. "You've done well for yourself, child. We always knew you were special." I smiled faintly, my fork resting mid-air. "Special?" I repeated. Back then, I was just the girl who forgot her place. She looked down, shame creeping into her expression. My uncle coughed awkwardly, forcing a chuckle. "We always believed you'd make it," he said finally, his voice trembling between pride and discomfort. I leaned back in my chair, the candlelight dancing across his face, and for the first time in my life, I felt no anger, just understanding. Everything they had said to me, every wall they had built between us, had led me here. I didn't argue or correct him. I simply smiled, calm, unreadable, whole. The room went silent, the weight of unspoken truths thick between us. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows like a sigh from the past. They came expecting to see the maid they had made. Instead, they met the woman she had become. And as my smile lingered, they realized that forgiveness can look a lot like power in disguise. Revenge is easy. Forgiveness is the luxury of the healed. And that day, I realized I was no longer the broken girl who once slept on their floor. I was the woman who had learned to build her own roof and still offer them shade. The morning after their visit, the sun rose quietly over the mansion, spilling golden light through the windows like a soft reminder of peace. I stood on the balcony with a cup of tea in my hand, watching the same street where I had once carried buckets of water barefoot. Below, I saw my aunt and uncle walking slowly toward the gate, their heads bowed not from age, but from the heavy silence of shame. For a long moment, I just watched them, not with bitterness, but with a strange tenderness I couldn't explain. It was in that stillness that I understood. I had already won, not because I was rich, but because I had peace. When I walked downstairs, they were in the foyer, ready to leave. My aunt fumbled with her words, her voice trembling. "Ebele," she said softly. "We didn't mean for things to be so hard for you. Times were different." My uncle nodded weakly beside her, unable to meet my eyes. I could have reminded them of the nights they left me hungry, of the names they called me, of the glass they threw into the rain with my few belongings. But I didn't. Because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's refusing to let pain decide who you'll be. "You don't have to explain," I said gently. "We all did what we knew. I'm not here to collect apologies." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my life, I saw her speechless. I turned to my assistant and spoke softly. "Make sure they take some food for the road, rice, oil, yams. And tomorrow tell the estate manager to offer Uncle a position at the warehouse. He'll oversee the inventory. It's light work, but steady." My uncle's head snapped up in disbelief. You'd give me a job?" he stammered. I nodded. "Everyone deserves a chance to begin again." The words came easily, but inside, my heart trembled. It wasn't pity that moved me. It was understanding. I had once needed someone to believe in me when I had nothing. Now I was simply returning what life had taught me. My aunt's lips quivered as she whispered, "Ebele, we don't deserve this." "No," I said quietly, "but grace isn't about deserving." That afternoon, the town gathered outside my gates. Word had spread quickly. The once rejected housegirl had fed the same people who had mocked her, given work. To those who had scorned her, and welcomed her family with open doors. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering prayers, calling me a blessing, a symbol of grace. Some said I was a miracle, but I wasn't. I was simply living proof that pain doesn't have to rot. It can plant something new if you water it with mercy. Days passed, and my uncle began his job quietly, humbly. He worked hard, showing up early, leaving late, never complaining. My aunt started helping at the orphanage I sponsored, cooking for the children the way I once wished she had cooked for me. She rarely spoke during those early weeks, her silence thick with guilt. But I noticed how she softened with time, her scolding tone fading, her laughter returning in small pieces. Sometimes I caught her staring at me with a kind of sorrowful pride, as if seeing my mother's shadow in me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber, she knocked gently on my study door. I looked up, expecting another thank you, but her expression was different, older, softer, full of something I hadn't seen in her before. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're your mother's daughter after all," she said, her eyes wet but smiling. The words landed deep, heavier than any apology. My breath caught. She had never spoken of my mother before. Not once. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she turned away, walking into the dim hallway. And for the first time, I realized forgiveness had uncovered a secret I didn't know I was still missing. Once, I slept on the floor. Now I build the floors others walk on. And every tile I lay carries the heartbeat of the girl who once prayed just to feel safe. When the mansion finally stood complete, shining white against the morning sun, surrounded by blooming roses and laughter, I didn't see wealth. I saw a memory. The echo of the rain that used to leak through the orphanage roof, the sound of my aunt's broom striking the tiles, the cold cement that once felt like home. Those memories didn't haunt me anymore. They guided me. They reminded me that blessings mean nothing if they don't become bridges. So, I made a decision. The following month I opened the gates of my mansion, not for guests of power, but for girls without names, without families, without roofs. I turned the east wing into a dormitory, lined with soft beds, clean sheets, and shelves of books. The library became their classroom, the garden, their playground. I called it the Floor Foundation, because the lowest place I had ever been was the beginning of everything I built. The first night they arrived, the house filled with small voices and footsteps. Some of the girls stared in disbelief at the beds, afraid to touch anything, their eyes wide with wonder. One whispered, "Madam, is this really for us?" I smiled, kneeling beside her. "Yes," I said, "because I know what it means to have nowhere to lie, your head." She burst into tears, and I held her close, feeling the universe fold in on itself. The child I once was embracing the children I now sheltered. Days turned into weeks, and laughter began to fill the halls that had once held silence. The girls learned to read, to dream, to believe that they were more than the labels the world had given them. Some of them reminded me of myself, quiet, timid, afraid to take up space. I taught them how to stand tall, how to speak without apology, how to see worth in their reflection. "We are not what people call us," I would tell them. "We are what we choose to become." The town spoke of me differently now, not as the girl who rose from dust, but as the woman who planted hope where pain once lived. Even my aunt, who now volunteered at the foundation, had begun to smile again, the hard edges of her heart softening with each child she served. Sometimes I caught her watching me from afar, and though we never spoke of the past again, her eyes carried something like peace, and that was enough. One morning, during the opening ceremony for a new wing of the foundation, the mayor called me forward. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and a crowd gathered to watch as he handed me a plaque engraved with my name. "You have changed the story of this town," he said. "You turned rejection into redemption." I smiled, but my heart was elsewhere. Not in the applause, but in the faces of the children watching, their eyes bright with dreams that would outlive me. That night, after everyone had left and silence returned, I walked barefoot through the mansion, through the rooms that had been built from memory and mercy. I paused in the hallway where the marble gleamed like still water, and for a moment I could almost hear the echoes of my younger self, sweeping, scrubbing, praying. My chest ached with gratitude, the kind that doesn't shout, only breathes. I knelt slowly, my fingers brushing the cool floor beneath me, the same way I used to do when I was a scared little girl, trying to find warmth in the dark. But now, there was no fear, no hunger, no loneliness, only peace. And every night before I sleep, I touch the floor, just to remember where I came from. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you never miss another tale of pain turned into purpose. Comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you were in her place? And remember, sometimes the people who fall the hardest are the ones who rise to build the highest.